Welcome to our seventh module, which is all around fieldwork. So now we are definitely approaching the practical part, and I'm very happy that I can share my experiences from the practical fieldwork, from data collection, from realizing empirical research and ethnography. And well, we have three parts in front of us that's where I want to share knowledge about history. So we will start with a little historical introduction, and then we will slightly turn over to the practical part. As the final part, I would like to focus on the issue of research ethics, which is a really important point during these days. So let's have a look on the schedule for this seventh module, and let's get the class started. As you can see, this class consists of three main parts. So we will start with a little historical introduction to get to know how fieldwork started in history. Then we will turn over to the second part, which is about the practice and about the question of how do you conduct a fieldwork. So how to prepare a fieldwork, what do you need to consider, and well, how do you simply realize it? What is important to know? The third part is about I called it the golden rules for present researchers. This is focused on the question of transparency at fieldwork, on the ethical approach, and also about some preparations like the research ethics form, which you need to know and also to fill before you start your fieldwork. So, first, I would like to introduce how fieldwork started in history. We will get into the topic with a little overview on the principal phases, where I will explain the evolution of our discipline. And we also will get to know how the first ethnographers, who they were, how they worked, and we will have a look at their profiles and also their approaches. Related to that, I would like to share some information with you about recording and documentation in the field. Well, starting from the early methods and devices. Here we will also discuss the question of the challenges of early documentation. So, which were the possibilities and the premises, and which kind of challenges needed the early researchers to face. Then we also will have a look at the situation when the early ethnographers came back home. And last but not least, I prepared a lecture in two parts for you, where you will read some fieldwork classics, let's say early classics, and a second part is about the present challenges and will introduce the famous publication Shadows in the Field, which is really which is really something that you must have read when you go on a fieldwork, which contains a lot of practical advice and which also presents the challenges and what you have to expect. So, first, to get this class started, I would like to focus on the start and on the question of how fieldwork started in history. Here we will have a look at the different phases, just to give you an overview on the, let's stay on the 4 phases, on the 4 stations of our discipline. So first, it started in the late 19th century with the first expeditions and with the so-called armchair anthropology. Then in the early 20th century, around 1900, we already enter the phase of the academic institutionalization. And this phase is followed by a flowering of ethnography. This is around 1920. Then around the 80s and 90s, until the new millennium, we have a crisis, but not only a crisis of the discipline, but also a variety of new approaches, which I would like to share with you. Well, the first phase, as it is called the armchair anthropology, and the moment of the first expeditions is a phase which is marked by a British group of researchers around Charles Darwin. They were called armchair anthropologists. An expression that maybe sounds a little bit strange to you when you read it or hear it the first time, but it is called like that because the groundwork for comparative studies and the analysis are based upon texts and, material which was collected by missionaries, by traders, scientists, and travelers, but not necessarily by the researchers themselves. So they analyzed and they wrote about regions which they, in fact, never visited. But at this time, it is also important to know that the premises and the worries about the nature of ethnography and of what it means to collect data and to record natural situations was not really the same concern and didn't have the same weight like today. So that's why the armchair anthropologists wrote about foreign countries and exotic regions, other continents, and based and relied on the material which other travelers brought back home. Then we have the beginning of the academic evolution and of the integration of the discipline of the anthropology and of ethnography at the universities. So here we have the German anthropologist Franz Boas, who established anthropology at the department, the anthropological department at the Columbia University in New York in 1899. This was the prime example and the start of the institutionalization. Here, Boas argued that it is important to conduct a fieldwork and that fieldwork, a practical fieldwork, is essential for the understanding. After he conducted an extensive fieldwork of 20 years in the Pacific Northwest coast. And Malinowski, also one of the principal researchers and, well, still an idol until today, also undertook his fieldwork in the Western Pacific. So Boas and Malinowski were kind of pioneers for fieldwork and also for a kind of new approach and interpretation of what is what of the premises of fieldwork and how to conduct ethnography in a correct way. Then we have the period, the phase of flowering of ethnography and ethnographical fieldwork, which started around 1920. This is basically started by Malinowski's Bible for the anthropologists. The Argonauts of Western Pacific, which is still very popular until today, which he wrote in 1922. And here the anthropologists especially focus on the introduction and on the methodological chapters. We also will read a part from that to give you an idea. Here you already have some changed premises in comparison to the armchair anthropologists, because at this moment, in this phase, the premise already includes a kind of native approach. Here it is important for the researcher that he spent really an extended period at the place and in the country, in the region, with the people he likes to investigate, that he learns their language, that he also observe and participate in their daily life. So the so-called participant observation that you already know from the methodological section, from the 6th module. Well, here the premise is the life among natives. This is the important, and this is something that qualifies the researcher to not only understand their culture and premises and costumes and whatever, but also to identify patterns and to transmit the knowledge that he could collect during the fieldwork to other people, for example, to his own people. Well, at this very moment, fieldwork at the very place became popular and also dogmatic for the coming generations. Well, here you can see some difference. Well, here we still have some difference when it comes to the role of the researcher, because living among the natives was one thing, one important question, but another question was also the treatment of the facts. So what can we take as hard facts, and well, also the worries about subjectivities and the role of a researcher were very different from the approach that we have these days. Around the 1980s, the period, the phase changed, and the anthropology stepped into a crisis. But not only into a crisis, but also in a moment of new approaches. Here, some debates and questions came up, like how is the representation of the other, so of the people who are investigated? Then what is the researcher's status and role? So what is the role of a native, and what is the role of a researcher? And then we also had the question of the ethnographic data and the question of objectivity, of subjectivity, of closeness and distance to to the people during research, and all of that stuff, which is highly debated and discussed during these days. One of the most important issues was the question of objectivity, and also the question of the concept of the other and the exotic. Along with that came the tendency that fieldwork should not only take place in foreign countries and other continents, but there was a tendency to conduct fieldworks also in Europe, for example, that fieldwork can take place at home, basically, with their own culture, even though there were also other issues and questions which came up and which we will discuss later. To get a little bit more into the practice and to learn about the roots, the beginning of fieldwork and ethnography, I would like to focus on the conditions of early fieldwork. So, who were the first ethnographers, and which were their conditions of recording? And last but not least, also, which were their destinations of preference? What was interesting? So, the point of start was basically the interest in exploring foreign countries and foreign cultures. So, to discover the exotic cultures, what was exotic? Well, basically the other continents, namely Africa, Asia, Oceania, and the Americas. This was around 1900 until 1950, more or less. Then, we passed through the moment of the academic evolution and development of the discipline, which took place during the 20th century. Now I would like to get over to the profile of the first ethnographers. So here, you already know their destinations and the countries of interest. And now we would like to know, well, what was their profile? So who were these people? As I already mentioned in an earlier moment, you had expeditors, you had missionaries, you had traders, and they traveled around during months and years and collected different kind of information about the so-called exotic cultures. Here you can see a little bit the profile and also the reasons why they went there. So first we had the missionaries who traveled for religious reasons. So namely, they traveled namely to other continents and to foreign countries in mission of the Catholic Church with the aim of missionating the people and to transmit and to spread the Christian religion. Then, as a second category, we had the travelers and the adventurers who were searching for adventure and maybe also a better life or a lucky destiny. Some also went and traveled to other countries for curiosity and to discover unknown parts of the world. And the collection of material and of information about these countries was more or less something, well, which they did along the way. Then we also had the traders and the expeditors who went out to explore the new countries and continents, mainly for the government, also on their own, for personal reasons, but also in mission of the government. And as a fourth group, we had the researchers, so the professional researchers and scientists who went to these foreign countries with the mission to explore and to collect information, namely for scientific reasons. So, as next step, now that we know the profile of the first ethnographers, I would like to get a little bit to the question of the tools and of the devices, of the technical devices which they had for documentation and recording. As you can see, the possibilities were a little bit different from the tools and devices which we have these days. So around 1900, the Edison phonograph was invented. This was a travel phonograph, as you can see here on the photo, and it worked with the so-called wax cylinders, which were the sound carrier for the phonograph. Then another possibility was to take field notes, to write diaries, and benefit from the traditional manner of writing observations and, well, every kind of stuff into a notebook. Yeah, beside the diaries and the field notes, it was also possible to prepare questionnaires and to conduct interviews. But, well, another time, just to make it sure, the form and the style of how to conduct interviews was also a little bit different from what we are realizing these days. So basically, you had possibilities of recording, of writing, and writing and collecting information. Yeah, the invention of the Edison phonograph was really a milestone in the history of fieldwork. Why? Because before it was not really possible to record any type of sound during travels, and yeah, it was also not possible to take technical equipment like, well, for sound files, to produce sound files um, during fieldwork to other countries. So this technical revolution really facilitated the fieldwork and the ethnographers' work, but even though remained, yeah, a lot of difficulties which still had to be solved. Well, which were the difficulties? First, the travel phonograph. Well, yeah, it was transportable, so this was an advantage, but it was still a very heavy machine. It was sensible, so the materials were sensible, and it was very voluminous for travel. Then another point is that it was only working with wax cylinders. The wax cylinders, on the other hand, were transportable and handy, but they had a very short duration. So imagine that with a wax cylinder, you only could record sequences of from about 2 minutes, and they had a limited number of possible reproduction. This was another weak point, because imagine that you come home with the wax cylinders, and then after a number of times that you reproduced the sound, they couldn't, well, they didn't work anymore. Yeah, caused by the material. So another point, if you keep an eye on the duration, not only on the material and on the issue of reproducing the sound, but also on the sequence. Imagine that you assist a ceremony which, with a duration of several hours, or which takes place all night long or whatever. And then if you record a sequence of 2 minutes, it is very nice to get an impression, but you never ever can record the full ceremony. It will be a kind of impression, an extract of what you see, but there's still a big part missing. So if you compare the advantages and even keep an eye on the remaining difficulties, you easily note that there are still some points left to improve. So on the side of the advantages, we yes have the positive point that now it was possible to record the original sound and not only rely on some taken notes or observations in the diary in a written form, and it was possible to document some original sequences in the original context. So if the researcher recorded the sound, he really could do that directly in the field and take this sequence back home to transmit an impression to his people. On the other hand, there are still some difficulties left. because first, the material, like the Edison phonograph and also the wax cylinders, were very sensible and very fragile. And the journeys and travels were hard, and well, there were some challenges, with the weather, for example, with climatic changes and so on. And there's also another limitation, which were the short sequences, so the short duration and the limited times which they were possible to replay. And another weak point, another difficulty was also the exclusive reproduction and recording of sound. It was not possible to record any related and accompanying video. Some other another difficulty was the perception of the technical instruments from the part of the field participants. So if you imagine that the researchers went to Africa, to Asia, to Oceania, and so on, and to populations which never get in any contact with technical devices, you easily can imagine that for them, any technical equipment and the instruments which were not really handy were very were strange, and they were not familiar with that stuff. So this also had an influence on the recording itself, because for the people, when they were practicing and when they were realizing their ceremonies, for example, they naturally pressed attention to these strange instruments which the strangers brought with them. Then we also had other types of early tools for documentation. Now we are stepping away from the technical devices, and here on that side you really have the part of the collection. Like, for example, you could collect documents from archives or also from personal possession. You also could collect handwritten manuscripts, for example. It was possible to collect objects, tools, and instruments, so physical objects. And it was also a way to look out for paintings, for pictures, for drawings, even for music sheets, for example. So all of these sources are part of the repertory and of the possibilities of the early tools and methods of data collection. So here we have the handwritten and the printed sources, and when it comes to the objects or also to the drawings and to the music sheets, for example, then you also have the handmade or handwritten versions. And for sure, if it comes to the music, if it comes to pictures or whatever, it was also possible to have a printed version related and dependent to the object. Well, at this point, I would like to have a look at the challenges, because as I said, the first researchers and the first ethnographers had really tough times when it came to the travels and also to the data collection. So, what exactly, which situations did they face? Well, first, you can imagine that the travels contained a variety of challenges. So the journeys were long and uncertain and often took place on ships or also by foot. So as they could not um, enter an airplane and get to their place in little time. So normally they had journeys from the duration of several weeks or even months until they could arrive at the place of their fieldwork. Then they also had heavy baggage because, well, as you saw, the instruments themselves, so the instruments for recording, were already heavy and unhandy. There were circumstances and conditions which did not really facilitate the journey and also the conservation of the perfect state of the instruments, such as strong rain, sun, and stormy weather on the ocean, for example. Then there also were climatic changes which could affect the instruments, like hot weather or even a humid climate or whatever. And they also, well, this was more something which was ideal for the researchers. They also had to deal with illness and, well, did not in any case had a chance to get the right treatment or to find a doctor to help them, whatever. Then, with a regard on the technical devices, as I mentioned, these technical innovations and possibilities were already innovative, but still problematic in comparison with the possibilities that we have these days. So we are talking of highly sensible technical instruments, which also were unhandy and which were specific and difficult to handle or even to repair. Imagine that you are in a place far away from home and something, something does not work. You have an Edison phonograph, a travel phonograph, for example, and for any reason it has a defect and there's no chance to repair because you cannot even reach out for the tool that you need to repair it. And, well, another difficulty was also that these instruments were unhandy and, well, not really familiar for the participants. If we are talking about the early documentation and the challenges which came along, then we can't only consider the technical devices and circumstances and the circumstances and conditions of the travels, but we also should keep the context and the situation of recording in mind, as well as the limits. So if we focus on the situation and the context of recording from the present point of view, then yes, there is the question of authenticity regarding principally the circumstances of recording and the original context and setting of the situation. What does this mean? Well, imagine that a researcher realizes a recording, well, the recording of an event, of a ceremony, of a situation or performance out of the original context. This is something which is seen very problematic today. One of the famous examples is a group of native Indians performing a ritual song in front of a phonograph. So you can imagine that it is not only the question of the recording of a ceremony, for example, and um, the well the um, the fact that the technical devices and the unhandy instruments of the researchers and explorers were strange to the natives, but it was also, for example, a situation that songs were taken out of a traditional context, as for example the song this this situation when a researcher asked the natives to perform a song exclusively for recording, and this song was related and deeply connected to a religious context. This is something which is really problematic from the present point of view. And we also need to keep the premises and the conditions of recording in mind. So not only the unhandy instruments, but also the capacity of recording of the sequences and the difficulties with the material, the necessity, for example, to change the wax cylinders when one sequence was finished. Well, it was very difficult for the researcher to conduct fieldwork with these technical devices and with the possibilities which were common and which were available during these early times. Now we are already getting a little bit to the question of authenticity, which is a kind of complex and multi-layered term. Because, if we record, if we document and conduct a fieldwork and empirical research in present times, then we want to capture a natural situation and an unaltered situation in its original context. So a cultural interaction, a performance within the traditional setting and in its original context. That means that we don't act as a stranger, that we need to be sure that the participants already are acclimated of ourselves and that we are practically not there. So we pretend to don't be there. We want to capture a situation which would have taken place in exactly the same way without our presence and without ourselves recording this happening. So this is what this is the model and the premise that we have today. But the first researchers conducted their work a little different, and this is also the case when it comes to the question of coming home from research and, well, what to do with the material. So, as you can imagine, the researchers didn't only undertake their travels for the reason for scientific reasons. They also were travelers, they were missionaries, and they basically collected information and, well, wanted to transfer, wanted to bring back and, well, give an impression from the field and from its people, but outside the original setting and context. Yeah, here we have an example which is very famous. I took it to give you an idea of a performance which takes place out of the original setting, and also to introduce, to present one of the biggest and of the most famous ethnographic collections. It is the phonogram archive from Berlin, which was under the direction of Karl Stumpf. And here the researcher established an extensive collection of around 17,000 sound sequences from cultures and continents from all over the world. Even though here enters a point that we discussed, namely the recording of sound and ethnographical work out of the original context. For example, they recorded a Thai orchestra in Berlin in 1900, and one of the most famous examples that you can see here is the recording of an Indian chief in Washington, using an Edison phonograph. So this is one of the examples that I mentioned and that I described. Well, as you can see, the Indian chief has his traditional clothes and everything, but he is sitting in front of an Edison phonograph, in a recording studio. So you can imagine that this situation probably is very strange for him. And here, he has to sing some traditional songs from his people. And, well, what can I say? I think you have an idea of the difference between the recording and the documentation and, well, the field records in early times and what we want to do, or also what we want to avoid today. Then we enter a new level and a next phase of technical innovation, which really facilitated the life of many researchers. So in 1826, the photo camera was invented, and this camera was also already handier than any apparate that you could use and that you could take with you as a technical device before. Then in 1960 and 1962, we have the invention of the tape recorder and the cassette. So this was also a milestone in the technical technical innovation in the history and the milestone in the history of fieldwork, because here you really have the possibility to record longer sequences and, well, not illimitated, but still longer than it was possible with the Edison phonograph, for example. And in the end of the 1960s, well, in more or less in the beginning of the 1970s, there is the invention of the videotape recorder. So now it was also possible to record, well, video sequences and not only sound files. One of the difficulties here was that the tape and the tape recorder and the cassette and the video recorder were a kind of luxury articles, and, well, yes, they became available for public use already around the end of the 60s, but you also need to keep in mind that these devices were very expensive, and not every researcher had the conditions to buy them. Even though it was a great invention and innovation for the researchers, and, yeah, in comparison of what you saw, what was possible and available before, yes, a great innovation. Well, now I would like you to take a little time to reflect about the possibilities and advantages, but also about the challenges and the consequences of the early fieldwork. So take a pen and a paper or your computer or whatever, and try to to revise and to reflect a little bit about these issues, principally in comparison of what you already know about fieldwork today, about present fieldwork, about our possibilities, and also our philosophy. So, what is the approach? Which premises do we have? What are things that we make different in comparison to the early researchers? And, well, also, which are our aims and objectives when we conduct a fieldwork? We will discuss all of these issues in depth in the second part, so in the following part of this module. But I would like to keep you very sensible for these issues, and that's why try to make a little brainstorming and collect your impressions and also your thoughts about in a comparative way. Now, as a last part of this first class from the seventh module, I would like to share an exercise with you, which is a lecture on fieldwork. It is divided in two parts, so you have 4 lectures for every part. The first is about fieldwork classics, and here I like to share 4 essential publications for classics of fieldwork, and invite you to read these texts through and to answer several questions about different issues and challenges of early fieldwork. So the first text is from Malinowski from 1922. It is a publication which I already mentioned in the historical overview. This is a kind of Bible for the ethnographers and for the anthropologists. And well, here, I will share some questions with you that I would like you to answer on this text. So let's get started with the lecture from Malinowski. And here we have the participant observation, so the central method from the ethnographical work and fieldwork, the documenting and experiencing as the central topic. The questions which are related to this lecture, to this text that is provided for you on the additional material are 3 questions. So first, I want to know, what is the imponderability of actual life and on fieldwork? How is this described by Malinowski? Then, how does Malinowski suggest that ethnographers should observe and record the imponderability during fieldwork? And last but not least, I also would like to know, why is it good for the ethnographer to sometimes put aside the notebook and the camera? So why can it also be helpful that sometimes you just benefit from observing and participating, but without any note taking or active documentation of the moment? So these are the main questions that I would like you to answer on the text from Malinowski. And then, as a second example, we have Stross. And here, as the main topic, we have the data collection and the gathering of field data. Related to this text, there are 4 questions to answer. Namely, I would like you to list the different kinds of research methods that are mentioned and that Stross uses during his fieldwork. So which methods does he mention during the description? What kind of methods do you use for fieldwork? Then I also like to know, how did he familiarize himself with the field location? So how did he approach? As a third question, there is the question of the relationship between Stross and the informants or the participants, the field members. So which kind of relationship did he had, in which kind of way did he connect with them? And well, I also would like you to note down some observation on the question of objective, of closeness and distance to the participants. And last but not least, there's the 4th question, which is namely of what unexpected problems did the ethnographer run into? And how did he resolve these problems? So this is the second text. And as a third example, I selected a lecture from Textor, which is about communication with the informants, or well, with the field members, with the participants of the research. For this text, I would like you to answer on the following questions. First, I would like you to observe and describe the relationship as it is described by Textor between himself and the informants, the participants. Then another detail which is related to that is how critical were the informants to complete the ethnographic research. And then, as a third issue, I would like you to reflect on the question of the importance of learning the local language. So, if you go on a fieldwork, if you want to conduct an ethnographic research, then is it necessary to learn the language of the participants, of the field members in advance? And why is it relevant? So, what is the essential point about the language? As a fourth example, you will get a lecture from Lensman. And here we have the topic of the field notes, of writing field notes and field diaries. Related to that text, we have 4 questions that I would like you to discuss. Namely, well, we will start with the question of the emotion. So how did the emotions of the research participants impact the ethnographer's field notes? Then I also want to know how were historical, archival, print, and phonographic materials used in their study. And well, as a third question, please answer on how did informants assist with this? So the integration, the collaboration between the researcher and the research participants. And as the last question, I would like you to take some notes on how critical do you think that informants are to conducting ethnographic research? Well, this is the first part, which contains some extracts from, on the different topics and the different questions and issues of fieldwork on the example of the fieldwork classics. And then there is a second part, which is mainly about present fieldwork. So here I provide some chapters from a very famous publication, which is called Shadows in the Fields. Yeah, I selected 4 texts, 4 chapters, which are dealing with challenges and also with some important issues from modern fieldwork. You have the first example from Timothy Cooley, then you have the second from Jonathan Stock, the third from Nicole Baudry, and the fourth from Anthony Seeger. And as you can see on the titles of the chapters, well, we will deal with some issues which are really from present days. So the first chapter, the sixth chapter, the first text is about virtual fieldwork. The second is about fieldwork at home. So here, if you compare the type of fieldwork with the first destinations of the early researchers and ethnographers, then you already have an idea why I selected it. Then we also have the question of the challenges of human relations in ethnographic inquiry. And we also have the text from Anthony Seeger, which is about the joys, dangers, and potentials of advocacy and fieldwork. So, related to every of these selected chapters from Shadows in the Field, I provided some related questions, like in the examples of the fieldwork classics that I presented to you and that you can find in the related material of this model from the course. So now we already reached the end of the first part of this 7th module on fieldwork. I hope you took a lot of different information from this class, and you have an idea of how fieldwork started in history, and also an idea about the technical challenges, the technical possibilities, and also the premises. And now we will get over to the second part, which is really a very practical approach, and where you can learn how to conduct and how to conduct a fieldwork and what do you need to be best prepared. See you there.